All right, so welcome back. I want to start looking at binding in additional resources to our shaders for three major reasons. First of all, I want to be able to write a uniform buffer so that I can have a camera, move it around and stuff, get a model view projection matrix in there. Secondly, I want a storage buffer so I can write a whole bunch of model matrices into a buffer, send that through so I can instance my drawing and draw a whole bunch of different things. And thirdly, I want to get images, especially there's a project I have in mind, but I want to do images. So first of all, how do we get resources into a shader? Well, typically in OpenGL or something, we would have a binding, and that binding would refer to a resource. So what we can do is we have something called a descriptor set layout. And the descriptor set layout, we can visualize it as essentially the shape of the shader. So it's the idea that binding 0 is a uniform buffer, binding 2 is a storage buffer, and so on. And this doesn't change, but what will change is the individual resources which are bound. So we have a descriptor set, and there's nothing unique about a descriptor set. I should say, yeah, we can have a whole bunch of them. So we can have one which refer to some set of resources, and then another which refer to some different set of resources or the same resources, it doesn't matter, and we can have heaps of those. But what does have to be true is that the resources have to roughly line up, or they have to exactly line up with the descriptor set layout. So if binding 0 is a uniform buffer, then each of these binding zeros within each of the descriptor sets have to refer to uniform buffers. But otherwise, we can swap these in, that's okay. So finally, of course, we have, I guess we could say we have resources, which are the underlying image views. Why did I spell resources wrong? The underlying image views, uniform buffers, what else? Sampler objects and things. So whatever these things are, some sort of underlying resources, and then we have descriptors. So I guess you could say a descriptor literally describes a resource. So for instance, we could look at this one and say, okay, this descriptor here describes a buffer. It's a buffer descriptor, and it refers to this particular underlying resource. It has an offset of 0, for instance, within the buffer, and the range is X bytes, how much of this buffer is covered by this one. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of descriptors, who knows? But then what we need to do is we need to write to a given descriptor set. So we have a descriptor set write object, which refers to some descriptors. So they are the source that we're reading from, and the destination that we're writing to is some given descriptor set. So something we could do is, if the underlying resources change, we could write to a descriptor set, or upon creation, write to a descriptor set, and then on the fly, while we're rendering, we bind a given descriptor set. And that has to conform to the descriptor set layout. But all of that being done, we then have access to it in the shader. So the idea here is we declare as much as possible, declare and validate as much as possible up front, and then it's very straightforward to bind as we're drawing.